September 19, 1863. The Battle of Chickamauga was tearing through the woods of northern Georgia. Smoke hung between the trees, rifles cracked from every direction, and thousands of men struggled to understand where the enemy line even was. Among the Union soldiers was Private Jacob Miller of the 9th Indiana Infantry. He was 25 years old, far from home, and caught inside one of the bloodiest battles the American Civil War would ever produce. The fighting became chaotic. Units collided in the forest, officers shouted orders that vanished beneath the gunfire, and men fired through drifting clouds of black powder smoke at shapes they could barely see. Miller moved with his regiment as the Union line came under increasing pressure. Somewhere ahead, Confederate troops were advancing. Then, in a fraction of a second, his war seemed to end. A projectile struck Miller directly in the forehead. The impact dropped him to the ground. With blood covering his face and the battle raging around him, anyone who saw him could reasonably have believed he was dead. The Union position collapsed around him. Soldiers withdrew, leaving wounded and fallen men scattered across the battlefield. Miller remained motionless while the fighting moved past the place where he had fallen. But Jacob Miller was still alive. Sometime later, he regained consciousness. His head throbbed, his vision was impaired, and the battlefield around him had changed completely. The most terrifying realization came next: Union troops were no longer around him. Confederate forces now occupied the ground. Miller had awakened wounded, disoriented, and effectively behind enemy lines. He knew that staying where he was could mean capture or death. Somehow, despite the wound in his forehead, he began trying to move away from the Confederate position and back toward friendly territory. Every step would have been difficult. The battlefield was littered with broken equipment, abandoned weapons, wounded men, fallen horses, and dense smoke. Miller had to navigate all of it while badly injured. His survival was extraordinary, but it did not mean the wound was minor. The projectile had left a deep injury in the front of his skull, and the effects would remain with him for the rest of his life. Miller eventually reached safety and received medical treatment. 19th-century battlefield medicine had limited tools, no modern imaging, and few ways to determine exactly what fragments remained inside a wound. Doctors could treat bleeding, infection, and visible damage, but they could not simply scan Miller's head. The surviving soldier had to live with uncertainty about what the projectile had left behind. He recovered enough to continue living, but the wound never truly disappeared. A visible depression and scar remained in his forehead, an unmistakable physical reminder of Chickamauga. Years passed. The Civil War ended in 1865, armies disappeared, and soldiers returned to civilian life. Miller grew older, but the injury from that September afternoon continued to trouble him. He later described persistent headaches associated with the wound. While the country moved into a new era, Miller carried a private piece of the battlefield with him every day. Then came one of the strangest parts of his story. According to Miller's own later account, about 17 years after Chickamauga, a piece of lead worked its way out of the old wound. Imagine the shock. The war had been over for more than a decade, yet material from the projectile that struck him in 1863 was still emerging from his body. The story did not end there. Miller said that decades after the battle, additional pieces of lead also came out of the wound, long after the men who had fired the original shot were forgotten. By then, Jacob Miller was no longer a young infantryman. He was an aging Civil War veteran whose forehead carried one of the most dramatic surviving wounds associated with the conflict. Photographs taken later in his life show an elderly man with a clearly visible mark in the center of his forehead. The image made his story difficult to dismiss as mere legend. In 1911, nearly half a century after Chickamauga, Miller's experience was reported in an Illinois newspaper. He personally described the injury, the lingering pain, and the fragments that had emerged years later. By that time, the Civil War had become history for a younger generation. But for veterans like Miller, the war was not simply something in books. Its consequences remained visible on their bodies. Miller had survived something that, at first glance, seems almost impossible: a direct shot to the forehead on a 19th-century battlefield, followed by abandonment among the dead and wounded. His survival was not evidence that such wounds were harmless. Quite the opposite. Battlefield head wounds were extremely dangerous, and Miller's case was remarkable precisely because so many others did not survive. What makes his story especially powerful is its length. The moment of impact lasted less than a second, yet its physical consequences followed him for more than 60 years. He lived through Reconstruction, the arrival of electric lighting, the automobile age, and the First World War. Through all of it, the scar from Chickamauga remained on his forehead. Jacob Miller died on January 12, 1927, at the age of 88. More than 63 years had passed since the day a projectile struck him during the Battle of Chickamauga. His story survives because it connects the enormous scale of the Civil War with a single human body. Battles are remembered through maps and casualty numbers, but Miller carried his battlefield history on his face. A bullet ended countless lives during the Civil War. Jacob Miller's did not. Instead, the wound became a lifelong reminder of one extraordinary fact: on September 19, 1863, he was struck in the forehead and survived.